authorities in Cumberland have concluded that in all cases, the killers are eating the flesh of the people they murder. Murder victims show evidence of having been partially devoured by their murderers. The killers are eating the flesh of the people they kill. The people they kill. The people they kill. The people they kill.
Zombie movies, TV shows, and video games have been part of the cultural zeitgeist for decades, and they certainly show no sign of stopping. The origins of zombies as part of our popular culture derives from Haitian voodoo folklore, or at least as they saw it during the early 20th century. It was combined with influences from Mary Shelley and H.P. Lovecraft. The various iterations of zombies over the years has become a reflection of the issues of our culture at the time. We're going to explore the origins of zombie films and how the representation of the creatures have changed over the years. Beginning with the film White Zombie, widely considered the first real zombie film. How George Romero inadvertently changed the definition of zombies with his film, Night of the Living Dead, and how zombies would react in a modern setting with the Korean film Train to Busan. I'm Lauren with Everything is Gray, and rather than talk about great artists who have done bad things, we'll discuss in this episode finding the light in darker works of art, and the importance of seeing how this is a reflection of our current culture. Let's start by digging into the origins of zombies. The origin for zombies primarily comes from Haiti. In Haitian voodoo folklore, zombification would be performed by voodoo sorcerers known as Bokor or Kaplata. I don't mean to oversimplify aspects of a deep and complex religion, but essentially the zombification of Haitian voodoo folklore entails necromancy, the raising of a corpse in servitude of the Bokor. Legend, and some really sketchy science, says that the initial death of a zombified person is caused by the poison tetrodotoxin, or TTX. TTX is the poisonous chemical found in the livers of pufferfish or the bite of a blue-ringed octopus. It's a naturally occurring poison that causes paralysis, particularly in the respiratory system. The victim then appeared dead and was buried. The Bokor would dig up the body after the TTX wore off. The victim would then be constantly poisoned over the next few years using datura, otherwise known as gypsum weed. The effects of datura are similar to scopolamine. It's essentially a dangerous deliriant that's described as unpleasant. It can cause hallucinations, amnesia, and confusion. Pretty much me on Monday mornings. The usage of these chemicals in the zombification process were documented by Wade Davis, a Canadian professor who documented his research in the book The Serpent and the Rainbow, which was adapted into the 1988 movie of the same name starring Bill Pullman. Davis's research has been controversial, as the supposed scientific research didn't really provide scientifically replicatable results, basically creating more questions than answers, and it certainly hasn't stood the test of time from when it was published in 1985. The Haitian folklore version of zombification has its roots in religion and spirituality, while the influence of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein has a much more scientific basis. From 1968 on, zombie movies will typically have a scientific explanation for their zombie apocalypse, while movies prior to 1968 will typically have a religious or spiritual basis. Widely considered the first zombie movie, the 1932 film White Zombie tapped into the Haitian origins of zombification.
They are not men, monsieur. They are dead bodies. Zombies, the living dead. Corpses taken from their grave or made to work.
This was typically seen as the original view of the zombie. A creature that was originally human and then after supposedly being buried after death is then risen as a servant of the Bokor. This movie fits the original version of the zombie, which was a being risen from the dead, was controlled by the person who made that zombie. This was the public's perception of zombies up until 1968. In White Zombie, the Bokor is portrayed by Bela Lugosi of Dracula fame. His character, Murder Legendre, which may be one of the most villainous names in cinematic history, is the antagonist who controls zombies to run his plantation. In the film, Legendre has people who he has zombified work his plantation in Haiti. In White Zombie, the film follows the story of a young couple visiting Haiti, Madeline and Neil. The young couple meets up with a plantation owner, Charles Beaumont. Beaumont finds himself in love, and more like infatuated, with Madeline. Beaumont then seeks out fellow plantation owner, Murder Legendre, for his help. Legendre then offers to make a potion for Beaumont that will turn Madeline into a zombie that he can control. Giving her the potion, Madeline dies. Legendre and Beaumont return to the tomb to raise her back to life as a zombie, something that Beaumont would later regret. The interesting thing about zombie movies is the way that they're told. The setting, the origin of the creatures depicts an interesting snapshot of the time that they're released. White Zombie was released in 1932. At that time, the United States had invaded and controlled Haiti militarily since 1915. Colonialism is a major theme of White Zombie. This is a time when the US and many European nations were entrenched in their colonization of overseas territories. Ultimately, colonialization is about control, much like the original zombification of people. Beaumont and Legendre sought to control a woman in the same way that the colonialization of Haiti was about control, as well as to limit the influence of outside forces. In Haiti, the US had the desire to limit the influence of pre-World War I Germany in the Caribbean, but control of the people means an increase in power and an increase in control of the country. There was the exoticism to the American public of a Haitian religion, one that was used to create a sort of xenophobic mysticism. The lack of control that the zombies had, working for Legendre, rang an empathetic bell with the American public. In 1933, the US and much of the world was in the midst of the Great Depression. Many people were out of work and had lost their homes. The fear of losing control to powerful outside forces was significant. People were afraid of losing their agency to the banks and governments and the politicians. And in 1933, we were also in the midst of social change. In a highly patriarchal society, women were previously viewed as possessions. The women's suffrage movement of the years prior finally gave women the right to vote in the US. By the time White Zombie was released, women had only been allowed to vote for only 13 years. The fear of losing control over women and desperately seeking supernatural forces to control them indicate the fear that men had over losing this control. During this time, the women in the Western world were experiencing more freedom than ever. Prior to the Great Depression, more and more women were entering the American workforce. After the Great Depression hit, any woman who had a job was seen as having taken a job away from a man. The zombification of Madeline is seen as a metaphor for male control over female agency. Fast forward a few decades, and the way Hollywood viewed zombies changed in the late 60s. In 1968, a young director just getting off a stint working for Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood decided to make his first feature film.
I guess the original idea for Night of the Living Dead was basically inspired by a novel, a Richard Matheson novel called I Am Legend. Richard actually jokes with me about saying that I stole his idea. And I keep saying, no, my guys aren't vampires. They certainly aren't vampires. They're not even zombies. The zombies, to me, were, those boys in the Caribbean who do the wet work for Lugosi. And I thought I was creating a completely new monster. The neighbors suddenly turned into flesh eaters, ghouls. And that's what I called them, ghouls in the film. And I thought they were completely new. What I really was saying, which I didn't articulate until the second film, was when there's no more room in hell, the dead will walk the earth.
In 1968, director George Romero changed zombie movies forever with his classic film, Night of the Living Dead. While making Night of the Living Dead, George Romero never referred to his creatures as zombies. In fact, most movies that deal with zombies will rarely use the actual term zombie. Romero referred to his creatures in the film as ghouls. This movie changed the modern perception of what a zombie is. Rather than the mindless undead that were controlled by a singular master, these ghouls, or zombies, were nearly mindless, acting on their own base instincts and nothing else. And that was the need to survive by feeding on the living. This is the zombie trope that nearly every zombie film released since 1968 has followed. Night of the Living Dead was a low-budget movie. They say that necessity is the mother of invention, and the low budget of this film necessitated the change of Romero's original idea, from the original flesh-eating aliens to being flesh-eating ghouls. The casting of Night of the Living Dead is notable because the lead actor was portrayed by Dwayne Jones, a young black actor from New York City. This is at a time when black actors did not play the lead role in films that would primarily have a white audience. His character of Ben was not specifically meant to be black. Romero just found that Jones was the best actor he could find. Contrary to black characters in white movies at the time, the character of Ben is shown to be intelligent, resilient, and a strong leader for those trapped in the farmhouse. He's the first black actor to portray the lead character in a horror film. While there are parallels to be drawn to the civil rights movement that was taking place in the 1960s in the United States, particularly as the film was released just shortly after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., those specific coincidences are just that. You can hear George Romero talk about the casting in the role of Ben here.
Dwayne Jones, the actor who played Ben, was very concerned, and almost the only one who was concerned about his being African American. We were going, hey, come on, man, it's 1968. We're all past all of that. Little did we know, right? When we made the first print of the movie, and we were driving it to New York to show it to potential distributors, we heard driving in the car. One of the producers, Russ Striner, and I heard the news on the radio that Martin Luther King had been assassinated. Now, all of a sudden, it was a black film. It became a black film. Even though when Jack Russo and I wrote the script, character in the script, we assumed him to be white. When Dwayne agreed to play the role, we didn't change the script. The same things would have happened to him if the actor had been white. The fact that these redneck posse guys shot him, that became racial instead of just a mistaken identity, which is really what we intended. Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons that people believe to this day that it's important. And in a certain way, it was a mistake.
While any specific civil rights parallels in Night of the Living Dead are coincidental, the casting of a black actor in a role that wasn't specific to any race is notable, particularly for the 1960s. The film ends when an armed posse arrives at the farmhouse. When Ben emerges from the cellar, he's accidentally shot by the posse. This can certainly draw parallels to the actions of law enforcement with regards to people of color, but this was not something that Romero had originally envisioned. It's only in retrospect that we can create this parallel and not the intention of the writer and director. The specific themes to Night of the Living Dead, like other zombie movies, are a reflection of the time it was made. In 1968, fears of the Cold War were high. There was a fear in Western society of nuclear annihilation, an unstoppable force that individuals felt as though they had no control over. At the same time, the US was in the middle of the war in Vietnam. This was a war where the atrocities and brutal imagery were finally being broadcast and shown to the public. The media depicted in this film talks about the zombie apocalypse and atrocities in a matter-of-fact style. In a way, that demonstrates our numbness to the violence overseas. Only this time, the matter-of-fact violence and brutality is in our own country. This movie also depicts the breakdown of the nuclear family. The majority of the film takes place in a farmhouse, which is a symbol of the traditional American life, which in 1968 was evolving beyond the typical family of the 1950s. We see conflicts within the Cooper family that's trapped in the farmhouse, and then the ultimate breakdown of that family when Cooper's daughter Karen gets infected and proceeds to kill her mother and eat the corpse of her father. The 1960s distrust of the government is seen in Night of the Living Dead in the way that the US military is unable to contain or control the zombie outbreak. Instead, rural areas are rescued by armed posses. At some point after the release of Night of the Living Dead, modern culture changed its depiction of what zombies actually are. Rather than the living dead that are controlled by a master, a term I'll use because it becomes an apt metaphor for slavery, the post-Living Dead zombies have specific qualities with minor variations depending on the film. They're formerly dead, they're slow-moving, and they're relentless. They'll either try to eat human brains or human flesh to survive, and a bite or sometimes a scratch from a zombie will turn the recipient into a zombie themselves. It creates the trope of a heart-wrenching scene where a group of survivors has to say goodbye to one of them after they received a zombie bite. This occurs in almost every single zombie movie. One constant amongst zombie movies is the means with which to kill a zombie. This entails basically destroying the brain, either through the use of a gun or a blunt object or a blade. Sometimes we'll see various origins of zombies, whether it's a virus, a fungus, medical experiment, or nuclear fallout. We're used to seeing zombies as slow-moving creatures, but some films, such as World War Z or the 2004 Zack Snyder remake of Dawn of the Dead, have zombies that run full speed at their victims. But George Romero has something to say about the fast-moving zombies.
Zombies cannot run. I say this definitively, as the grandfather or the godfather of zombies. Zombies cannot run. So anyone who has a zombie running, don't listen to that person. Their ankles would snap. I mean, what did they do? Go and join a spa the moment they rose from the dead? Give me a break. They're dead.
It's about accepting your fate. Nobody lives forever, and to acknowledge this while you're still alive allows you to make the most of your life, and to make your life count. But gone are the zombies created from the Haitian voodoo. That's rarely seen in films after 1968. with a few notable exceptions such as The Serpent and the Rainbow, based upon the previously discussed discredited work of Wade Davis. The other example that comes to mind is the truly terrifying Weekend at Bernie's 2. So what makes zombies such a powerful metaphor, especially for today's audiences? When it comes to the zombie apocalypse that's depicted in most of these films, it takes us a step backwards in society. There's this breakdown of all technology, the very means that we use to communicate and feel like we're part of a larger society. That's gone. We envision ourselves as the protagonists trying to survive, putting ourselves in a situation where we think about our basic human needs, something that has gotten lost in our social media age. We get to lose ourselves in a world where cell phones don't matter. The movies are a character study of our own humanity. What type of zombie survivor would you be? Somebody who protects the helpless? Someone who's only interested in their own survival? Would we work together or go our own individual ways? I tried counting the number of zombie movies released since the dawn of filmmaking, but wound up being way too tedious. The number I'll estimate is over 700. When it comes to films based upon horror tropes, zombie movies seem to make up the vast majority of them. It's this reflection of society that keeps audiences of every generation coming back to these zombie movies, oftentimes with different themes and metaphors for the creatures in these films. Let's examine George Romero's second installment of the Living Dead series, Dawn of the Dead. This is the first film where he actually refers to the creatures as zombies, while the behavior of the creatures in this movie is similar to the first zombie film, Night of the Living Dead. The original Dawn of the Dead was released in 1978, 10 years after the original. Again, the world is a different place. Consumerism was becoming more popular in society, so what the zombies represent is also different. Rather than taking place in an old farmhouse, the majority of Dawn of the Dead takes place at the symbol of the late 1970s consumerism, a shopping mall. In the original Dawn of the Dead, a group of 4 people escaping the city seeks refuge in a mall, a symbol of American consumer culture. They barricade themselves inside with an almost unlimited supply of goods, food, and medicine. The zombies themselves are drawn to the mall, as turning undead reduces them to their most basic primal needs. Something inside the zombies is drawn back to the mall. Something ingrained in their original form as living consumers remains, as if it's part of their basic primal need. The survivors who are residing in the mall find themselves invaded by a biker gang who in turn allow the zombies back inside the mall. In this situation, we realize that the biggest threat to humanity isn't the zombies, it's the human nature of wanting to have what you do not have. The breakdown of societal barriers that previously allowed humankind to move forward, again, pushing us further back into a devolved society. The mall itself creates an illusion of safety and control. There's a certain safety we feel when we're in the mall, being part of consumer culture, surrounded by our peers in a safe environment. Dawn of the Dead destroys that illusion that we built for ourselves. It reveals the mall itself to be a trap. The survivors are trapped in what we would consider to be one of the safest environments. It shows that the materialism of the consumer culture creates a false sense of safety when it's really just a trap. The theme of class division is prominent in Day of the Dead. The zombies in this film reflect the working class, the people considered undervalued, mindless, and exploited. The biker gang represents those that reject the system. They're there to sow chaos and exploit the situation for their own personal gain. The survivors staying in the mall represent those who enjoy the capitalist comforts, initially failing to realize the fragility of their situation once their comfort of safety is removed. Dawn of the Dead met with significant critical praise. Roger Ebert even referred to it as one of the best horror films ever made. It's one of the sequels that many critics opine is better than the original. Then in the 21st century, we saw a resurgence of the zombie movies, TV shows, and video games. It ushered in popular films like 28 Days Later, the Dawn of the Dead remake from Zack Snyder, and the Korean film Train to Busan. Video games like The Last of Us and the Rising Dead series. A successful graphic novel series called The Walking Dead. This was turned into a successful TV series that has so many spin-offs that they completely clutter up my Netflix recommendations. Let's start with the movie that ushered in the 21st century zombie resurgence, 28 Days Later. This movie features the zombification as a result of a fast-spreading virus called rage. The 21st century is a time of medical innovation. The medical industry began incorporating genetic modification into advances to fight disease. With these advances of technology, some people in our society became skeptical of advancing science through the use of genetic mutation. 28 Days Later incorporates these fears into the rage virus. The increased globalization of the world brought with it the fear of a new pandemic that could spread equally as fast. The rage virus did not raise the dead, but rather turned the victims into violent creatures that will attack any uninfected human. The virus essentially turns the victim into a rage-fueled monster, eliminating any rationality that would prevent them from acting out. In 28 Days Later, there's a specific loss of humanity that takes place. Initially, we see this loss of humanity in the zombies affected by the virus. But as the fabric that holds society together begins to unravel, we see that the survivors are beginning to lose their humanity as well. Where the virus causes near-instant rage in the victims, the survivors gradually start to lose their humanity due to exhaustion from trying to protect themselves from the infected. Family becomes a major theme in 28 Days Later. The main protagonist of the film, Jim, is brilliantly portrayed by Cillian Murphy. Jim begins the movie without any family. He wakes up in a hospital in a coma, perhaps the most alone and vulnerable a person can be. As the movie progresses, he builds a tight-knit family around himself with 3 of the other survivors. Here is when trust and cooperation become necessary for survival. This collapse of society, where it's easy to slip through the cracks, easier to be a loner going about your own life. This changes when the safety of that fabric of society begins to unravel. The weaker that a society is, the more necessary it becomes to rely upon other people. Along with the collapse of society, sinister patriarchal forces begin to emerge. The character of Major Henry West brings Jim and his chosen family in, only to use his authority to keep women in sexual slavery, supposedly to rebuild society. This indicates that the norms that a society has built up over centuries can be eroded just as fast as society itself. 28 Days Later wound up spawning 2 sequels and was very successful. Another force of nature was The Walking Dead. While The Walking Dead began as a successful graphic novel, its adaptation as a TV series was when it became a cultural phenomenon. The series spanned 11 seasons and birthed 6 spin-offs so far. Interestingly, with a TV series, there's time to develop more themes than you'd find in just a movie. A TV show can more easily follow character development over the span of years, which would be difficult to show in a film. The initial concept of survival gives way to the theme of rebuilding a community. You can see how individuals will adapt and grow in an apocalyptic scenario. Although there isn't growth with everyone, you'll witness characters that will devolve into their most basic instincts of survival to the detriment of others. As the society breaks down, so do the morals. There are no specific laws that the characters follow. The breakdown of society destroys the need for laws that oftentimes only exist to protect that society. Throughout the duration of The Walking Dead, the goals of the survivors change. Initially, the primary goal is to survive. After becoming a survivor becomes ingrained, the next step in the character's progression is to rebuild society. Society is the ultimate source of safety, and a return to perhaps what it means to be human. While The Walking Dead had seasons that were uneven in terms of quality, likely due to Frank Darabont, famed director of The Shawshank Redemption, parting ways with AMC, it still remains a successful demonstration of the public's fascination with zombies. The last film I'll get into on this episode is the 2016 South Korean film Train to Busan. This is a fantastic movie with probably the most terrifying zombies I've ever seen, both in the makeup used as well as the actions of the actors and special effects. Train to Busan shares many thematic similarities to the 2013 film Snowpiercer, which was directed by fellow South Korean director Bong Joon-ho, who would later go on to direct the award-winning Parasite as well as Mickey 17. In Train to Busan, a zombie outbreak emerges in South Korea. As the title obviously implies, much of this film takes place on a South Korean train. The main protagonist, Saku, is an upper-class businessman. He's mostly self-involved, a divorced single dad focusing more on his career than his family. Saku decides to take his young daughter to see her mother for her birthday in Busan. As a zombie epidemic infects passengers on the train, we see the variety of social classes forced together. The previous social hierarchy that would separate a train into different classes breaks down. The hierarchy becomes zombies versus survivors. For much of the film, the zombies are isolated from the living by the different cars, but the barriers between them are merely flimsy obstacles, in much the same way that the barriers between classes can be fragile. In the high-tech world of South Korea, or any modern country in 2013, it's easy to lose your humanity. It's in this collapse of modern society that allows for people to regain their humanity. As Train to Busan progresses, Saku evolves to be less self-involved, knowing that everything he's doing now is to keep his daughter safe. The parallels between Train to Busan and Snowpiercer both use train cars in an apocalypse to illustrate the difference between social classes, and that the only thing separating the classes is for one to break down the doors between cars. So why do we love zombie movies, shows, and video games? For me, one of the main aspects is that it brings me back to when I was a child, imagining myself in the world alone and how I would survive it. Some days, when it feels like the world is grinding us down, there is a catharsis in imagining that the society where we don't feel like we fit in completely breaks down. All we're left with is our ingenuity and our desire to live. Who wouldn't want to imagine the world breaking down in a way that our modern annoyances are no longer relevant? No more taxes, no social media, no bill collectors. Just humans doing human things, connecting with our more tangible and kinetic world. We get to take a moral inventory of ourselves. We get to ask ourselves, how would we survive? Would we be the lone wolf or someone who tries to rebuild society? On a show like The Walking Dead, with such an array of characters, it's easy to envision ourselves in many of them. Although, just like watching Game of Thrones, definitely don't get too attached to any one character. In a post-COVID-19 world, we witnessed how a society reacts to a global pandemic that places a significant strain on society and individuals. Somehow, all of these zombie origins due to a virus hits a lot closer to home. We got to witness how a pandemic can bring out the best and the worst of us. And to be honest, watching a zombie movie or show can just be great fun. If you have the stomach for the inevitable gore, watching hordes of mindless creatures chase humans around is a pretty good time. The jump scares, the makeup, much of it pioneered by the legendary Tom Savini, who deserves a shout out for sure. Zombies are more than just monsters. They're a reflection of ourselves, and sometimes the survivors of a zombie apocalypse wind up being reduced to that same greed and violence as the zombies that are around them. Well, we had a lot of fun making this episode. My kids sat through so many zombie movies with me this week. Our favorite was Train to Busan, so it was a fun change of pace for this podcast. I'm Lauren, with Everything is Gray. Thanks for listening. This episode was written and produced by Lauren Bregenser. This episode is dedicated to all the survivors of a zombie apocalypse. You know who you are.
I'm not great at farewell, so that'll do, pig.
That's the worst goodbye I've ever heard. And you stole it from a movie.